I have, first of all, to offer thanks. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to David Harel and Israel Bartal for these wonderful introductions. The phrase knowledge-based hope is one that will, I think, stay with me. And I also want to thank Katarina Hayden, who is here, and the co-produced Religions group that has helped me think about so many things these past 4 years. So I can only offer the following, but what follows is going to be long. The sense of history's meaning. The sense of history's meaning, of its relevance to the possibilities of existence, varies across cultures. It varies across religions and times and places, and even within the experience of a particular group or individual. I think here of Marc Bloch, the historian, founder of the Annales School shortly after World War I, and what different hopes he had for history in the 1920s when he founded the Annales School than he did in the 1940s as a fighter in the resistance, in the French resistance after Germany's rapid conquest of France. In 1941, he wrote that he now understood, he only now understood, that the solidarity of the ages is so effective that the line of connection works both ways. By which I think he meant the past affects the present, and the present also affects the past, transforming it through reinterpretation, reinterpretations that can themselves transform the possibilities of life in present and future. And I will offer you always the texts, and I won't read them so that you can have the pleasure of the reading yourselves. So certain moments, we might call them moments of crisis, may produce particularly intense engagements with the historical and even reevaluations of its meaning. I take Bloch's own period, which encompassed the 2 world wars, so let's say from 1915 to 1945, as one such era, an era of intense debate about how best to understand the relationship between past and present and future, and how best to practice the historical. At around the same time, Walter Benjamin, found in Schlegel's 1798 dictum that a historian is a prophet facing backward, the starting point for an approach much more attuned than Bloch's to the roles played by religion in shaping the possibilities of relation between past, present, and future. The same is true of Martin Buber, whose name honors the lecture series I'm so grateful to participate in today. Across his long life, his efforts to, quote, prepare the way to the promised land through the thicket of this pathless hour, never ceased questioning the interrelation of the past, the present, the prophetic, and the political. Bloch, Benjamin, Buber, these are only 3 Bs among a much more diverse alphabet of thinkers who turned to the historical as they sought to understand the shifting possibilities of existence amid a crisis of modernity marked by, among other things, collapsing civilizational norms and the burgeoning threat of calamitous violence. We may ourselves be living in our own epoch of crisis and of engagement with the historical. And I should add, when I say engagement with the historical, I don't mean knowledge of or appreciation for history. The anti-historical or the ahistorical is also a form of engagement, just as in the words of my colleague Michael Walzer, who was a previous Buber lecturer, anti-politics is a kind of politics. It's impossible to diagnose one's own age with certainty. The present hour, to quote Buber again, is always pathless. But one symptom that we may be living in such an age is just how often intellectuals today have recourse to writers from the period between the world wars. There are many who draw analogies between the movements and struggles of the present and those from the 1930s and 40s. Think, for example, of how often the term fascist is used in political discourse today in order to categorize this or that movement in terms that purport to make historically legible who stands on the side of good and who, as the expression has it, stands on the wrong side of history. Such symptoms suggest a widening gulf between what I'm going to over-schematize as 2 historical sensibilities. One, aghast at mid-20th century horrors abetted by cadres of historians who spoke with vicious confidence about the characteristics of people and the direction of history, has tended to cultivate skepticism toward teleology, toward positivism, toward essentialism. It prefers to find professional refuge in contextualization, in the avoidance of anachronism, the relativity of perspective, in critiques of historical thought itself as an agent of power, and a suspicion of historians' claims to moral clairvoyance in the present. The other, aghast at the persistence of vast asymmetries of wealth, power, and possibilities for life in the various post-war world orders, including our own, seeks to put the past to the work of, I think the phrase is, bending the arc of history. It criticizes other schools of historical thought as agents of power, but does not itself embrace a neutrality it thinks of as impossible and complicit with injustice, positing instead a perspective of powerlessness from which the historian can offer the present some guidance toward a vision of the future good. Now, I say over-schematized because there are many other aspects to any given historian's sensibility. Moreover, these two do have similarities as well as differences, and rarely do we stand entirely on one side or the other, but rather most historians straddle, this is kind of a gross image, straddle the epistemological fissures that divide them. Yet it's my sense that over the past few decades, these two sensibilities have grown further apart, making it increasingly difficult to maintain a foot on each side. The more pressing the issue feels, the greater the difficulty. And one issue that feels particularly pressing and particularly difficult to many today is the politics of Israel. I'm going to pause on this phrase. As everyone here knows, until very recently, the word Israel did not evoke a nation state, but rather a category of people designated by prophecy, as when the Puritans of North America imagined themselves a new Israel, or 19th century French speakers referred to their contemporary Jewish neighbors as Israelites. By the phrase politics of Israel, I mean not only the politics of the nation state that today calls itself by that name, that is the state of Israel as subject, agent, or actor in history. I mean also the many ways a world shaped by Christianity and Islam has learned over the past 2,000 years to compete for power and for truth by arguing over the meaning of Israel's place in history. So the concept of Israel as an object of thought in the long history of ideas. The state of Israel is a powerfully acting subject in the present, and it's important to understand it as such. But I will focus today, as I did in anti-Judaism, on objects of thought in the distant past. And I do this not to distract from action in the present, but because it's my intellectual wager that we cannot understand critically the one without the other. We cannot understand, for example, the pressure that the politics of the nation state of Israel exerts upon our historical sensibilities in the present and on our hopes for the future, without also understanding how Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as well as their secular descendants, such as Marxism, themselves took shape by thinking about the history of Israel, and I won't put it in scare quotes to represent a figure of thought, but you can imagine scare quotes if you like, as they contested the meaning of the past for the future, developing together into distinctively historical religions. Hence, within cultures nourished by these religions, efforts to reveal the meaning of history have always had the potential to generate, and I'll paraphrase Marx, Israel from their own entrails. I should add, critiques of Israel here can mean critiques of Christianity and Islam, as well as of Judaism, since all three have understood themselves and each other in terms of Israel. But that was a theme of anti-Judaism, so I won't explore it today. My wager today is that in order to have a critical view of both past and present, we need to be able to reflect on that potential for historical thought to generate Israel from its own entrails. So to justify my wager, I'm going to offer 6 claims. Some are going to go very quickly. One is going to take a little longer. And I acknowledge in advance that some of these claims may seem obvious to some of you, and others are going to seem utterly unconvincing, and some may even seem both at the same time. The first claim is that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are historical religions in the sense that in these faiths, God's teaching is understood as revealed in history, and the past is understood as a source of truths about how believers oriented toward their eternal futures should live their lives in the present. And the second point is that it's through arguing about the past that the many different forms of these faiths have taken shape, relating themselves to and differentiating themselves from each other. In these faiths, the historical and the sectarian go hand in hand. I am reading all of these because they seem important, but I'm not going to read all the quotes, I promise. The third is that within these faiths, history has been understood as legible and revelatory, but also as mysterious and unknowable, both as having a clear and divinely established trajectory and as cyclical or even contingent on the human. This sharp debate over the nature of the truths history can offer is continuous and is never resolved. The two historical sensibilities I began by sketching are themselves a variant of it. Fourth, within that debate, and this is the point that I'm going to spend the most time on, certain focal points emerged at which the meaning of history was imagined as especially clear, points upon which the foundation of history as a science of salvation could be built. The politics of Israel was prominent among those focal points, made legible in many ways, among them the status of the Jews and sovereignty over Jerusalem. Fifth, and maybe this is the most controversial part, I don't know, but it will be very brief in my presentation. The Enlightenment emancipation of history from theology did not end this dependence of the truth claims of history upon figures of Judaism. Quite the contrary. The historical revolution of a Kant, a Hegel, a Marx, all reinscribed Judaism at the foundations of the historical, even as they sought to emancipate the historical from Judaism. And finally, I will ask, but I will not answer, the question of what all of this has to do with our capacity to ask in the present moment how the historical can help us understand the shifting possibilities of existence. How in this pathless present, in this pathless hour, can history help us? So first, what do I mean by historical religions? Simply that in these religions, the past is a source of knowledge about God, and therefore also about how believers should live if they wish to please God in their present, thereby affecting their prospects for an eternal future. In one sense, it's obvious that all three of these faith traditions find meaning in history. The Quran, for example, often suggests that there is a great deal to be learned about God and the soul from studying the history of the world, as here in the 30th surah, Surat Ar-Rum, the Romans. Repeatedly, the Quran reminds us that history is meaningful, that the ruins of the past peoples and places, and the Quran speaks very frequently of ruins, contain crucial signs for those who can decipher them. But just as frequently, it warns us that the deciphering is not easy. It requires not only attentive ears, eyes, hearts, and intellect, but also a sensibility to God's teaching. So here you have, with a hardened heart, you cannot learn the lessons of history. And then there's, of course, the question of why is the heart hardened, Pharaoh's heart, etc. There's long traditions behind every single text that will arrive here. It's a nice coincidence that Rome also figures in the title of an epistle written half a millennium earlier, in which the Apostle Paul offered a sensibility similar to that of the surah, focusing first on natural history rather than political history. And long before Paul, even before the rise of the people called Romans, the Israelites were already urged in Deuteronomy to inquire about bygone ages that have come before you. Study of the past would instruct them to observe the commandments, that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may long remain in the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you for all time. In the same vein, the psalmist urged God's people to give ear to the past. Again, there's a lot of words. I highlighted the ones that are perhaps most important, and it's far too many words on one slide. I apologize if those in the back can't make it out. But notice how the psalmist offers the prophetic past as a primer from which the future can learn why God rejected the clan of Joseph, did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, choosing instead the tribe of Yehudah, Mount Zion, which he loved. So history here is a sectarian process, retrospectively revealing the true meaning of the divine teaching by making politically clear who was right and who was wrong. Paul, too, makes human theological error historically visible. At the beginning of Romans, for example, we learn how sodomy was introduced into the world to punish those Gentiles who erroneously chose to worship idols and other created things rather than the creator of the world. But in Romans, the historical tables turn when the Gentiles are invited back into God's covenant through Jesus' life and death. Now it is Israel, rather than the Sodomites, through which the consequences of not recognizing God become historically clear. Paul characterizes the Israelites who do not follow Jesus as the vessels of wrath that are made for destruction. He's citing the Greek Jeremiah here. It's striking that although Paul's letter was composed more than a decade before the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Israel already emerges in the letter as a broken archaeological object destined to serve as a theological lesson to humanity, a lesson that the Gospels will quickly amplify after Jerusalem's destruction. So we've already seen that the Quran uses human and archaeological ruins as proof that God punishes those who turned away from prophetic teachings. It even predicts that this cycle will apply to its own proclaimer. And it makes clear, I'm still speaking of the Quran here, that the implacable contest to understand history is part of God's plan. For each among you, we have appointed a law and a way, and had God willed, he would have made you one community, but he willed otherwise, that he might try you in that which he has given you. So vie with one another in good deeds. Unto God shall be your return altogether, and he will inform you of that wherein you differ. So note that the vying, the competition is ongoing, and only at the last judgment will it become clear who was right. On that day, which the Quran calls the day of distinction, or the day when all secrets will be put to proof, the direction of history and the meaning of history will be evident. But in the meantime, believers must interpret the past cryptic teachings as best they can, applying their interpretations to life in their present in the hope of finding the right path to God. In this sense, history serves these historical religions as a form of soteriology, is I think the technical term, a science of salvation. Which brings me to the second point. These three religions are not only historical, they're conjointly historical. They have shaped themselves in their many different forms by arguing about who has better interpreted a past imagined as shared. They draw on a common reservoir of prophecy that they understand to have been revealed in historical time and that they believe contains instructions for how to live in the present to gain eternal life in the future. The stakes could not be higher. Hence the intensity with which all three faiths have developed tools to scrutinize the sacred past. I think here of Timothy of Baghdad, patriarch of the Church of the East from 780 to 823, whose example I encountered in a recent study by Rebecca Scharbach-Wallenberg. Timothy was working on a more accurate translation of the Syriac version of the Old Testament. But he complains that all the existing texts circulating among Jews and Christians are full of discrepancies. He's heard a rumor of a trove of manuscripts obtained by the Jews of Jerusalem from an Arab hunter whose dog had wandered into a cave containing this trove. What the Jews of Jerusalem now have, he believes, is access to early and uncorrupted texts that he hypothesizes were hidden in a cave. Whoops, I have skipped Yeah, there we go. Were hidden in the cave by the Jewish prophets themselves to protect them from the future destruction of Jerusalem, which they foresaw. Timothy has been interviewing converts from Judaism and writing in vain to Jewish leaders in Jerusalem in the hope of obtaining these texts for which he longs with, quote, a burning fire in my loins. In my heart, sorry. Freudian slip. That longing, and indeed Timothy's entire editorial enterprise, is not fueled by merely academic or antiquarian passions, but by the conviction that humanity's eternal future depends on the sciences, philology, archaeology, history, through which God's past teachings can be discovered, tested against competing versions, and correctly interpreted. I offer Timothy as but one example of the countless ways in which these three historical faiths have been continually competing over the content. We could add the Dead Sea Scrolls, if we liked, as a more modern example, over the content and meaning of the prophetic reservoir of history, forming and reforming themselves in terms of their own and each other's claims to that authoritative past. I can't amass here examples from each tradition, so I'm going to simply invoke a general teaching attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Like Surat Al-Ma'idah, this tradition presents every moment in history as pregnant with sectarian competition between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, a competition deciding salvation. Who is on the right path will not be clear until the end of time. But the past does offer guidance. In a related tradition, the Prophet compared each of the misguided sects of his community, that is, misguided sects within Islam, with misguided people of former times. And he said, in general terms, you will walk along the paths of former peoples in exactly the same ways, so much so that if they entered the hole of a lizard, you will enter it too. So this tradition seems to find in the past an archive capable of rigorous, even deterministic exemplarity for the present. Perhaps it's this aspect of the Islamic tradition that animated the historical sensibility of the great North African polymath Ibn Khaldun, sometimes called the father of historical sociology, who wrote that the past resembles the future more than one drop of water resembles another. But other aspects of this tradition not only insist that the true interpretation of the past will not be known till end time, but stress the potential for radical difference and even contingency in the ongoing history of revelation. Surat Al-Rahman tells us that every day he reveals himself in a fresh state. A century or two before Ibn Khaldun, his much more influential fellow Andalusian Ibn Arabi interpreted this verse to mean that he, exalted be he, does not manifest himself in a single way to multiple peoples, or indeed in a single way to the same person twice. So here, no drop is identical to another. We've reached point 3. Within these phases, the meaning of history has been understood as simultaneously knowable and unknowable, revelatory and mysterious, divinely determined and contingent on the human. Is history legible or is it illegible? Is God's plan interpretable from the course of events on earth, or is the political history of human striving the wrong place to look for divine teaching? All three traditions have offered multiple and contradictory answers to this question. In them, debates over the knowledge history can offer have been sharp, sometimes optimistic, sometimes skeptical. But, and this brings me to point 4, upon which I will dwell at a little more length, in and out of these debates, certain focal points and political histories have emerged as especially revealing. The city in which we find ourselves, Jerusalem, provides an obvious example, for it is perhaps among the most convoluted of all the coils through which humanity has condensed divinity into history. I'm conscious that I stand before you on the day after Tisha B'Av, so I will offer a schematic of those convolutions to demonstrate how thinking about this place has shaped how much of humanity came to think about history. And when I say schematic, I mean schematic. I will talk about 10 minutes about Jerusalem, and my colleague Katarina Hayden, for example, has written two entire books on aspects of Jerusalem, and there are thousands more. So at the time of the first temple, very schematic here, there were apparently Israelites who saw in Jerusalem a clear and permanent marker of God's favor, maintaining that Jerusalem could never be defeated thanks to the presence of God's sanctuary. So this is a model of divine action in history. Divine intervention at a given time and place stops the flux of history, rendering a polity eternal. But it's not a very flexible model of divine action in history. And in the face of defeat and exile, the prophetic tradition emphasized a different approach. So in prophecies like this one from Jeremiah, sovereignty is linked to righteousness, making Israel's moral standing before God visible in the political history of Jerusalem. This model of God's action in history, and the more general version in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, has the advantage of delinking God's power from that of his people. If Israel is conquered, that conquest should not be attributed to the greater power of the conqueror's deities. The conquerors are instruments wielded by the God of Israel, who retains sovereignty over history, and in due course commands the Persian monarch, in this case, Cyrus the Great, who's even referred to as Messiah in the Hebrew Scriptures, to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So here, the legibility of God's will in the political history of Jerusalem continued to animate sectarian arguments throughout the Second Temple period, as you could see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But by far the most consequential of these sectarian reinterpretations were those of Jesus' followers, who already in their earliest writings were putting Jerusalem to new kinds of work. Paul's letter to the Galatians, for example, splits Jerusalem in two, opposing a terrestrial Jerusalem in slavery to a free heavenly Jerusalem. At the time of writing, so around 50 CE, Jerusalem was still ruled by Jews who did not follow Jesus' teachings, and Paul's interpretation presumably intended to emancipate the promise of salvation from sovereignty over the city. But the destruction of Jerusalem by Roman armies in 70 CE animated a different historical prophetic approach, famously articulated in the guise of Jesus' prophecy in the Gospel of Matthew. You see all this, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another, and all will be thrown down. So conquered Jerusalem and its shattered temple now become the physical sign of a new model of history in which cycles of transgression and punishment, repentance and restoration were interrupted by an irreversible transfer of God's favor. Early Christians continued to interpret the unfolding history of their own communities through the widespread logic of divine chastisement and forgiveness, but they assigned to the Jews a special historical meaning, that of a people irrevocably condemned until the end of history, a people whose disgrace was visible in the ruins of their temple. We all know that the historical theologies of the early followers of Jesus were sectarian reinterpretations of earlier, also sectarian Israelite and Jewish ones. My only slightly less obvious point is that these reinterpretations of the past transformed future possibilities for thinking about the historical. Jews did, and they still do, continue developing interpretations, often now in response to Christian and Muslim ones, of the exile from Jerusalem as God's punishment of Israel's sin and of God's ongoing invitation to righteousness and restoration in Jerusalem. In these Jewish historical theologies, repentance can rebuild the ruins of history. But within the Christianity that converted so much of the ancient world, Judaism, Jerusalem, and the Jews were assigned a very different historical function. The destruction of their temple and their perpetual exile served the future as testimony, like the ruins spoken of in the Quran, of the truth of the prophecies contained in the Old Testament, and even more importantly, of the truth of the Christian reinterpretation of those prophecies in the New. And that testimony became political the instant that Christianity became imperial. When the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to the faith, Christian scholars quickly produced histories in which he appeared as the culmination of God's divine political plan for salvation. When Constantine and his family built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here in Jerusalem while maintaining the temple in ruins, they were making the same claim in stone. This historical prophetic logic was so important that when Constantine's nephew Julian, known to history as the apostate, attempted to reverse the Christianization of the empire, he focused not only on restoring pagan sacrifice and revitalizing the teaching of the philosophers, but also on rebuilding the Temple of Jerusalem. The failure of that effort, reputedly in God-sent earthquake and fire, was further miraculous proof for the Christian interpretation of history. And it also spurred new attention to earlier histories, such as the Jewish War, in which the first century Roman Jew Flavius Josephus provided his account of the Roman conquest of 66 to 70 CE. It was after Julian's defeat, Julian the Apostate defeat, circa 370, in an anonymous Christian work, a rewriting of Josephus, aptly named On the Destruction of Jerusalem, that reaffirmed the defeated status of the city and the temple and established for all time the truth of the Christian claim to the Israelite record of God's actions in history. So I offer you here, and this is thanks to Katharina Hayden, a kind of redaction history of the multiple adaptations of Josephus. I will return to this slide because both Ibn Hazm and Ibn Khaldun, who I will refer to briefly in a minute, use some of these works. But imperial Christianity too experienced a version of the legibility question we've already encountered in the Hebrew Bible. If godliness should be visible in sovereignty, how does a religion maintain its truth claims in political adversity? Writing his City of God after the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, they were Arian, so the sack was not an optimistic sign for Catholic Christians. St. Augustine tried to separate faith from the fates of empires, earthly power from godliness, insisting that God's plan cannot be read in political history. Still, one people and one politics remained an exception. The political history of the Jews remained prophetically intelligible for Augustine, their exile serving as proof of Jesus' teaching. Augustine called the Jews vessels of wrath. He was quoting from Paul. Shaped by God as a perpetual history lesson, their misery reminding humanity until the end of time of what happens to those who deny Christ's sovereignty. So, like the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam also produced reinterpretations of Jerusalem's prophetic history and topography, as in an early Islamic tradition about the Caliph Umar's entrance into Jerusalem as its conqueror in 637-638. The Caliph was determined to find the original site of David's mihrab, as he called the ruined temple. And he called upon the assistance of Ka'b al-Akhbar, Ka'b of the rabbis, who in early Islamic traditions is a convert from Judaism who brings a lot of native knowledge to Islam. The tradition reports that the Christians had treated the site of the temple as a vast garbage dump. But Ka'b led the Caliph to a particular spot within this waste where he said the temple had stood. And I won't read you the passage, you have it before you. But this anecdote about the founding of a precursor to what would become the Al-Aqsa Mosque invokes the assistance of Judaism to counter the Christian claim that the history of prophecy ended with Jesus. The Islamic tradition, we might say, it gives the wheel of repentance and restoration one more turn in order to take away from Christianity and capture for Islam the biblical archaeology of prophecy and sovereignty. In some ways, the strategy is similar to the Christian one: appropriate the authority of an earlier community with claims to the history of prophecy and of Jerusalem, while stigmatizing the living representatives of those earlier traditions as misleading interpreters of their own history. So here you see Ka'b is put in his place as someone who has got something wrong. The rise of Islam did not end the co-production of history and theology in these three religions, nor did it diminish the meaningfulness of Jerusalem in that dynamic. To the contrary, In prophecy, as it is in physics, the three-body problem is much more complex than the two. We can glimpse some of that complexity in reactions to the projects of the Caliph Umar and his Umayyad successors, who built the mosques of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock upon the site of the temple. Some Jews praised and celebrated these caliphs, seeing in their project the cyclical restoration of the temple they dearly desired, and a messianic sign. For these Jews, the Umayyads were what the Persian Emperor Cyrus had been for Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Ezra, God's messianic agents in the fulfillment of history. But for Christians, on the other hand, Islamic Jerusalem threatened the foundations of their claims about history. Some 30 years ago, the 7th century Christian Anastasius of Sinai reports, I was living in the Holy City on the Mount of Olives at the time when the Capitolium was being excavated by multitudes of Egyptians. He means at the time when Al-Aqsa was being built. In the middle of the night, I heard in that place that was being excavated something like the sound of many people toiling, clamoring, crying aloud, and throwing a mass of earth out through the walls. And I realized it was the work of demons who were rejoicing at and aiding in an excavation such as this. So like the Christians who preached about Julian the Apostate's construction efforts 3 centuries before, Anastasius tells his story as part of an ongoing struggle over the past in his own present. And here he tells us why he deemed it necessary to tell about this demonic construction team building Al-Aqsa Mosque at night. The judgment still stands, he said. How can the temple of God be built in that place? The judgment still stands, which says to the Jews about it, behold, this house is left waste. Christ said is left, which is to say will remain a waste forever. For that last glory of the house was burned down in the time of Titus, and after the last there is no other last glory. Nothing is laster than the last. And I thank Katarina for the locution laster, which isn't real English, but it's perfect. Anastasius is attacking the Muslim claim expressed by building a mosque on the Temple Mount to have replaced Christianity as the arbiter of meaning of prophetic history. No true relation can be established by building there, he insists, because nothing is laster than the last. And the allusion is to this verse of Haggai, which speaks of, compares the glory of this latter Acharon house. Earlier Christians had developed a supersessionist reading of this text, interpreting Acharon to mean not latter, but last, in order to exclude Judaism from the ongoing flow of history. Anastasius deploys that Christian reading here to counter Islam's claim to the topography of Jerusalem and to the prophetic tradition. Just as the Dome of the Rock, or Al-Aqsa, cannot be a true house of God, because the second temple was the last, Muhammad cannot be a true messenger. So the competition here is over the direction of God's plan in history and over the role of the Jerusalem temple as an indicator of that direction. That competition did not end, and its power continued to produce new meaning in the past. David Gyllenhaal, who introduced me to Anastasius, has also brought to my attention the example of the efforts of early Islamic scholars to explain the meaning of the 114th verse of Surat al-Baqarah, the cow. And who does greater wrong than one who bars entrance to the mosques of God? The early authority, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who died around 767, wondered who is being disgraced and punished here. There are many candidates, including as many scholars might suppose today, Muhammad's opponents among his own tribesmen in Mecca, the mushriks of the Quraysh, who forbade the Prophet from the Kaaba, from the Masjid al-Haram. But according to Muqatil, the verse refers to the fact that the Romans vanquished the Jews, such that they killed them, enslaved them, destroyed Jerusalem, and filled it with corpses and slaughtered pigs. And then a second time in the Roman period, Titasar slaughtered them and laid waste Jerusalem. Muqatil sees evidence for his interpretation both in the Jerusalem of his own day and in the geopolitics of his time. Thus it is, he says, that today no Roman enters Jerusalem, but that he is fearful and wearing a disguise, for whoever sees one seizes them and punishes him. And then he adds, "Theirs is disgrace in the world." And he says, "They are being killed and enslaved, and Constantinople will fall, and Rome will fall, and Amorium will fall, and theirs is great punishment in the hereafter." Those are apocalyptic prophecies. Once those three cities have fallen, we know from contemporary Syriac apocalypses, this is meant to signify the end of the world. In their enmity towards the temple, the Romans, Byzantines put themselves very much on the wrong side of Muqatil's salvation history, so much so that the fall of their principal cities will initiate the end of time and their eternal punishment. I think nobody today remembers Amorium, then the largest Byzantine base of operations in Asia Minor, and it was indeed captured and razed by Muslim armies in 838. Constantinople fell in 1453. Rome still remains. But this was not a marginal tradition. Gathering commentaries on the same verse almost 2 centuries later, the most encyclopedic of all the classical Muslim collators of prophetic history, Al-Tabari, conceded that interpretations were multiple, but found one candidate for the Quran's curse most convincing. So Tabari is uniting 3 different episodes and peoples in the history of Jerusalem under one prophetic curse. There were the Christians whom Umar and Ka'b found dumping filth in the Bayt al-Maqdis, the Romans who destroyed the Second Temple, and Nebuchadnezzar, who some 600 years earlier had destroyed the first. This Islamic version of Tisha B'Av is just one more example of how, in these historical religions, all of time can be collapsed into a condensed point of prophecy in which believers in every present can find new meaning as they seek to learn from the promise of the past, how they should themselves step towards the future. And it's interesting to me, at least, that in this Islamic historical exegesis, Christianity stands anachronistically with Nebuchadnezzar. But that should be no more surprising than the well-known fact that in rabbinic teachings, Christianity stands with Esau and Edom. It's also interesting that at least when it comes to interpreting this Quranic verse, it's Rome and Christianity that Muqatil and Tabari put under eternal curse and debasement, and not the Israelites or the Jews. The point is important. Prophecy has the potential to produce many different histories for many different needs, contexts, and interpreters. The great Muslim scholar Ibn Hazm took a very different path around 1050 amid the collapse of his own Islamic polity, the Caliphate of Cordoba. He was writing against a Jew, Samuel ibn Nagrela, with whom he saw himself in competition for power and favor. And he sounds more like a follower of St. Augustine than of Tabari when he casts the Jews, exiled throughout the earth and deprived of sovereignty not only over Jerusalem, but over any land at all, as a legible and indeed infectious warning of God's plan for humanity. So Ibn Hazm's history, it met his present need, but it was not arbitrary. It drew not only on a vast knowledge of Islamic traditions, for which he was famous in his own time, but also on his research in the traditions of Jews and Christians. It's in fact his treatment of the meaning of Jewish exile drew heavily on a Hebrew work called the Sefer Yosipon, or the Book of Josephus. The Sefer Yosipon was a 10th century Jewish adaptation of 2 works I've already mentioned, Josephus's The Jewish War and the Imperial Christian On the Destruction of Jerusalem. And here too, there's an important point. Each of these historical religions produced historiographies that were in some way distinctive. But those distinctions were also co-produced in the sense that the text and traditions circulated among, betwixt, and between them, and were put to any number of uses, sometimes divergent, sometimes similar. And throughout this competitive generation of meaning from history, the meaningfulness of Jerusalem as a political index of rival truth claims did not diminish. You all know of the struggles known in the West as the Crusades, or the sharp conflict over the meaning of Jerusalem in the colonizations and decolonizations of the past 3 centuries. This brings me to my 5th point. The great modern emancipation of history from theology did not end in this dependence of the truth claims of history upon figures of Judaism, but to the contrary, it reinscribed Judaism at the foundations of the historical. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, considered the separation of history from theology as the precondition for critical thought. It is, he said, in this distinction that true enlightenment consists. But he imagined that separation as a Christian supersession of Judaism, even more thorough than the one undertaken by the early church. Indeed, according to Kant, the problem was that the early church had not sufficiently superseded its predecessor, but had instead allowed itself to be contaminated by Judaism and Jewish history. According to Kant, once the Jewish historical and statutory part of the church's faith was stripped away, the true Christian religion of reason would once more emerge, and peace would reign. All the world's conflict, he says, is due to this mistake of adopting the Jewish historical idea. My point, Kant's ideal for critical history depends on stereotypes of Judaism themselves created by Christian theological histories that he claims to overcome. Both his historical and theological ideals here are the products of Christian imaginings of Judaism. And in a world largely converted and shaped over centuries by Christian and Islamic prophetic histories articulated in relation to each other and to Israelite and Jewish ones, even the most secular and critical forms of historical thought cannot entirely escape the influence of their origin in the histories and theologies of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Many pages have been dedicated to Hegel's understanding of secular history as a progressive unfolding of the Christian idea, or to Marx's absorption of Hegel's historical theodicy into an economic process moving toward revolutionary overcoming of an alienation imagined as Jewish. Those looking for just one book can turn to Karl Löwith's 1949 Meaning in History, written in exile from his native Germany during and after World War II. He created a catalog in reverse chronological order of thinkers from Burckhardt, Marx, and Hegel to Augustine and the Bible, highlighting what he took to be the dependence of progressive philosophies of history on Christian eschatology. And of course, Löwith was primarily focused on a European tradition he understood as Christian, but one can imagine a similar volume more engaged with Jewish or Islamic traditions of thought. And of course, those traditions are not independent of each other, as we've already seen with Ibn Hazm and can easily attest in more recent times. Many Muslim anti-colonialist thinkers learned from Hegel and Marx, for example, just as many Jewish, Christian, and secular critics of colonial and post-colonial modernity have learned from Muslim thinkers. It's in part because of this that in the modern and postmodern eras, even at their avowedly most secular, thinking historically has retained the power to generate figures of Israel. In this sense, as Nietzsche put it, we are still living in the Middle Ages and history is still disguised theology. So let's turn now very briefly to the sixth and final point. What does all of this tell us about the capacities of the historical to help us understand the shifting possibilities of existence in the present moment? I referred earlier to two historical sensibilities, both critical insofar as they draw on the past to help us better perceive our place in the present, but the one more inclined towards skepticism and the interrogation of our certainties, and the other toward advancing a particular norm, ideal, or vision of the good. We need both. We must ask history to guide our hopes in the present pathless hour, knowledge-based hope, because we know that the future is not independent of the past. But precisely because of that interdependence, more specifically, precisely because our own historical philosophies and methodologies are themselves the product of prophetic ideals and habits of thought of the past, we must also be skeptical of those who claim to know the true path in the name of history. This may be especially important when our attention settles on peoples and places that our historical religions have treated as particularly significant bearers of meaning and sources of legibility. The risk that Walter Benjamin perceived so well in the 1930s remains today. Just as a man lying sick with fever transforms all the words that he hears into an extravagant image of delirium, so it is that the spirit of the present age seizes on the manifestations of past or distant spiritual worlds in order to take possession of them and unfeelingly incorporate them into its own self-absorbed fantasizing. This does not mean that critical historians cannot harbor hope for the future or deploy the historian's craft in the service of those hopes. It's true, as another giant of 19th century history, Jakob Burckhardt, put it, that historians are too often blinded by what he called Wünschbarkeit, or hopes, desires, ideals. Because many of those hopes are themselves the product of the historical religions we are studying, we as historians need to cultivate skepticism toward the ends we may ourselves dearly desire. But for the same reason, that is, because these historical religions continue to animate so much of humanity's capacity to criticize the world as it is and to hope and strive for a better one, it's also true that our work as historians of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can nourish new norms, new ideals, new ways of thinking about each other. Again, we historians stand astride a divide. We can cultivate our skeptical sensibility, or perhaps we can pronounce judgment from, quote, the tribunal of history. But we should realize that when we do the latter, we're speaking more as prophet than as historian. So how then can we, when humanity calls upon history in its hour of need, can historians responsibly honor their obligation to both criticism and to ideals, to skepticism and to hope? Standing here in Jerusalem, in whose history so many billions, I think it's accurate to say billions of people have over millennia imagined the destiny of humanity becoming manifest, it feels especially important to remember that this question is as difficult today as it was in the 1930s. Thank you. Ritual before knowledge.
Yeah, right. Just to make sure that you get it, okay? Should I open it or should I let him open it? You have to open
you open it, my hands are trembling.
Okay. So, Buber lectures get a medal. I hope so. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. We'll see.
Oh, wow.
Take this out, hand it to him. Professor David. Right to the photograph. Okay.
History without an image is not history.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are you willing to answer a few questions? If there, so we have time for just a couple of questions, comments. Yes, there's a microphone. Yeah.
This might be beyond your already very extensive subject. So right now there's, in the Catholic Church, Pope Leo maybe post-supersessionist attempts to read texts like the Romans 9 that you showed of vessels of wrath. Paul in a Jewish context, he didn't mean it. In your book, you note that whether or not he meant it, this is how it went into history, this supersessionist displacement, if not condemnation. Do you have any hope about where this movement can go, given its Christological challenges?
So there's only a few questions, but they're very hard ones. I think that Romans, vessels of wrath, every image, actually any image in Scripture, any revelation has countless multiple meanings and potential meanings. And I do have hope that people are constantly finding new meaning in Romans. In fact, I was reading an article by Karma Ben Yohanan this morning, and she has a very suggestive reading of Romans that I had never encountered before. And I think every verse of Romans, so long as there are people reading Romans, will continue to generate possibilities. And every possible interpretation can become the basis for a community of faith. That is how these things work. That's how these historical religions are constantly transforming themselves by finding new meaning in these revelations they understand as having been given in historical time. What I would say, though, is that the discovery of new meanings doesn't necessarily erase the possibility of the old meanings. We were talking in seminar earlier today about Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam, and his understanding of the past as a vast archive in which many things are lost but can be recovered. And when they're found, for example, anything believed by any Muslim ever in the past that can be recovered from that archive can become the source for new ways of thinking about Islam. So what I would say is, yes, we can imagine all kinds of new readings, but we shouldn't imagine that it will be possible to repress all the old ones, that the action of interpretation and the possibility of the creation of meanings stops within these phases. It's always ongoing, always dynamic. And that's actually, I think, the real commitment of our co-production project, is not to think of these as moments in which, after a parting of the ways, that kind of creativity stopped, but to think of it as an always ongoing potential for the discovery of new meaning in the past, and also for the transformation of old thoughts about the past in ways that will generate possibilities for the future. So it's not an actionable hope, but it is a hope.
Okay, any further comments? Okay, so I just hope that we are, just to take one of your last quotes, we are not in a state of delirium. I just hope for that. So thank you again very much
Thank you.
for the wonderful work.